Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Beckett Voss. Before the world went to hell, I made my living 50 feet above the interstate for a national outdoor advertising firm. I drove a heavy-duty service truck up and down the tri-state area, swapping out torn vinyls, changing blown floodlights, and tightening rusted bolts until my knuckles bled. I spent half my life filling out endless safety logs just so some suit in a climate-controlled office could certify the structure wouldn't collapse on a minivan. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly just grease, cold wind, and deadlines, but the pay cleared on time, and I got used to being the guy climbing the steel that nobody else ever bothered to look at. Most days followed a rhythm. Park on the shoulder, drag the extension ladders and gear bags out of the bed, and start the climb. On the newer monopole units, I had the luxury of an internal ladder and a service hatch. On the older skeleton frames, I was out in the elements, hugging wet iron that vibrated every time a loaded 18-wheeler hammered past in the fast lane below. You learn fast where the rust is just surface deep and where it's eating the load-bearing joints. You learn to keep your center of gravity low and your grip tight. That job taught me plenty about the world, too. I learned how sound travels strangely over miles of open pavement at 3 a.m., and how quickly freezing rain can turn a simple bulb change into a death sentence. Mostly I learned that people don't look up. I could be hanging right over their commute in a neon high-vis vest, and I was practically invisible. When the rumors about the sickness started, I was still up there rebooting dead power supplies in the freezing drizzle. It was late autumn, that gray time of year when you can see your breath inside the cab. The news anchors called it a severe flu in cities I'd never visited. Then they started listing towns along my route, places I knew by exit number. By the time the AM radio chatter switched from caution to outbreak, I knew my best chance of survival wasn't going to be down on the ground with everyone else. Traffic didn't stop overnight, it never works that way. It just thinned out, then changed rhythm, and finally started to feel wrong in your gut. At first, it was just small things I'd catch from the shoulder of the highway. I saw more sedans and SUVs riding low on their springs, suspensions practically bottoming out on the bump stops because they were packed to the roofliner with suitcases and boxes. I saw drivers white-knuckling the steering wheel with a 1,000-yard stare, and kids asleep under heavy winter coats in the back seat at 2 in the afternoon. I kept working my route because that's what you do. You go where the ticket tells you, you fix what's broken, and you move on to the next mile marker. The company's automated dispatch app kept pinging new jobs to my phone, so somewhere out there a server still believed the world was operating on a normal schedule. Most of those new tickets were clustered within a few miles of the same massive interchange, the one with the sprawling service plaza and 3 major fuel stations feeding off the same exit ramp. That plaza used to be a madhouse on holiday weekends. Now, it was chaos 24/7. Cars overflowed the marked stalls and lined the access roads, parking on the grass and blocking the fire lanes. Every time I pulled my heavy rig in, it took longer to thread through the gridlock to find a spot where I could still extend the boom or reach the base of a sign. Inside the main building, the frequency of the noise was off. It was too loud, but there wasn't any laughter. Just a low-level hum of anxiety. People stood in lines that didn't move, clutching plastic grocery bags and lukewarm paper cups like lifelines. The monitors over the food court had stopped showing ESPN highlights and were stuck on a loop of national news. Anchors with dark circles under their eyes talked around words they were clearly terrified to use. For a while, they stuck to the script. Severe flu strain. Travel advisory. Stay calm. Then the digital maps behind them started filling with angry red circles along the very routes I drove every week, and the room would go quiet in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I was strapped in on a mid-sized unit just off the main parking lot when I heard the first real sound of panic. It drifted up from the far end of the diesel islands, a sharp, jagged scream that cut right through the drone of idling engines and the murmur of the crowd. From my vantage point 30 feet up, I saw the crowd ripple. They bent away from one pump like a wave hitting a wall, then collapsed back inward. Someone had fallen. Someone wasn't getting back up fast enough. At the time, I wrote it off as a fight. People were frayed, the gas lines were hour-long waits, tempers were short, and you see enough rest stops to know how simple stupidity can turn into a brawl. I kept working because habit is a powerful thing. Finish the ticket, disconnect the harness, get back in the truck. By late afternoon, the scrolling banner at the bottom of the TV screens inside stopped suggesting travel caution and switched to a blunt, stay off the roads. Most people didn't listen. They tried to run. The highway in both directions jammed solid. Cars that couldn't move forward refused to turn back, locking bumpers. The on-ramps clogged with trucks jockeying for position, cutting off the smaller vehicles. I watched an ambulance try to run the shoulder, sirens wailing, but it barely made a mile before it ran out of pavement and got boxed in by a wall of steel. I finished a bulb swap on the massive tri-face board over the access loop just before full dark settled in. I climbed down slowly, taking my time because the galvanized steel was slick with condensation, and my head was spinning. The service road below ran along the back of the plaza, linking the loading docks to the fuel stations. It used to be a quiet alley for deliveries. Tonight it was an overflow lot jammed with people who had decided to wait out the apocalypse somewhere that had bathrooms and a Burger King. Near the loading dock, a different smell cut under the usual thick perfume of stale fry oil and diesel exhaust. It was the smell of copper and something sour like spoiled meat. 2 security guards, just rent-a-cops in ill-fitting uniforms, stood by a dark corner with a man between them. His hands were zip-tied and his chin and shirt were soaked dark with blood. One guard had his baton drawn and yelled, "Back off or we drop you right here." His voice was flat, terrified. The other guard just watched the prisoner's mouth with wide, unblinking eyes. I didn't go closer. Whatever was happening in that shadow was already way past the point where a maintenance guy with a wrench could help. I cut through a row of idling semis instead, heading back toward my own vehicle. The service app on my phone chimed in my pocket while I walked, pushing another job to my list like it actually mattered that a display panel was flickering 6 exits north. By the time night fully hit, the main lot was glowing under the high-pressure sodium floodlights and the building was buzzing with frantic energy. But out on the highway, the flow had turned strange. Gaps opened up where there used to be steady streams of headlights. Cars bunched in nervous, tight convoys, followed by minutes of total darkness. Standing by my truck, the cold finally working through my work gloves, I looked up at the tri-sided board looming over the loop. 3 tall faces, a heavy-duty solid steel I-beam structure, an internal ladder cage, and a service hatch at mid-height. I knew that unit inside and out. I knew every weld, every rung, every rusted bracket. The ground around it was thick with desperate people and stalled cars. But nobody was looking up. Nobody ever does until something falls on them. The thought landed in my brain, simple and crystal clear. If things kept sliding sideways the way they were, the safest real estate in this whole mess might be 20 feet up, inside a hollow steel sign I'd been tightening bolts on for 5 years. The idea didn't feel heroic. It didn't feel like a master plan from a survival movie. It felt like every other shortcut I had ever taken on a job site. Use the materials that were already laid out in front of you. Move a few steps sideways instead of hiking a mile in the wrong direction, and just pray nobody asked too many hard questions when the invoices came due. Except now there was no head office to report to, no supervisor breathing down my neck about overtime. There was just the chaotic plaza, the jammed highway, and that 60-foot steel tri-sided board standing silent off the access loop. I didn't climb it that first night. I won't pretend I was that smart or that brave right out of the gate. I sat in the cab of my truck with the engine killed and the door cracked just enough to bleed the excess heat without freezing myself out. Outside, the world was dissolving. People walked past my bumper clutching duffel bags, plastic baby carriers, and cheap gas station blankets. One kid in a bright red coat stopped and stared at the logo on my door like it meant someone was still in charge, still coming to fix it, until his mother yanked his arm and pulled him back into the crush. From where I sat, slumped low in the driver's seat, I had a clear line of sight to the service access door at the base of the sign's monopole. It was just a plain gray steel panel secured with a heavy-duty padlock, stamped with my company's property ID near the hinge. I had unlocked that door a dozen times over the years for routine maintenance. I knew exactly what was behind it. A narrow vertical cage with welded steel rungs running up the center of the hollow column all the way to the top hatch. On the other side of that hatch was a catwalk frame ringed by 3 massive advertising faces and a built-in steel grating floor. I watched the lot and waited for a better idea to present itself. It never came. I ran through the alternatives in my head. Try to drive the rig off-road through the ditch? I'd get stuck in the mud within 50 yards. Try to barricade myself in the Plaza bathrooms? Too many entry points. Too many desperate people. The crowd pushed toward the glass doors of the main building, leaving the dark corners of the lot strangely empty. A couple of shouting matches broke out near the pumps when someone tried to cut the fuel line, their voices cracking with hysteria. A man in a dirty tweed sport coat coughed hard enough to double over, bracing himself against a trash can before staggering into the men's room with his hand clamped over his mouth. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody waited to see who or what came back out. The news broadcast playing inside the plaza had finally used the word undead. I saw it happen through the window. A woman at the doorway dropped her coffee cup and just started sobbing when the anchor said it. That was the tipping point. Sitting in the truck waiting for somebody else to draw up a rescue plan wasn't going to get me through the next 24 hours. If I was staying anywhere near this interchange, I wanted altitude, steel walls, and a single choke point that I could control. I waited until well after midnight. The lot never truly emptied, but the rhythm changed. Families retreated inside the building and didn't come back out. Lone drivers slumped in their seats, tilting their chairs back for fitful sleep. The loud, aggressive types burned out their adrenaline and either drove off into the dark or quieted down. Out on the main highway, the traffic thinned to the occasional streak of high beams and the low, grinding growl of a heavy hauler trying to put distance between itself and the cities. When the plaza felt as calm as it was ever going to get, I made my move. I strapped on my climbing harness, grabbed a headlamp and a small canvas tool bag, and stepped out into the biting cold. The air had that hard, metallic edge it gets just before the first real killing frost, clean enough that every breath stung my throat. I locked the truck out of pure habit, punching the fob, even though I was pretty sure door locks weren't going to mean much by morning. Crossing the lot took longer than it should have because I refused to draw eyes. I wove between the rows, hugging the shadows of the larger SUVs and delivery vans, making sure my heavy work boots didn't slap the pavement loud enough to carry. At the base of the tri-face tower, I stood for a long moment with my gloved hand resting on the freezing metal of the access panel, just listening. The highway hummed in the distance and a backup diesel generator behind the plaza chugged on a steady, rhythmic beat. Somewhere in the dark, a baby cried once, sharp and thin, and then went quiet. No footsteps approached. I took out my keyring, fumbled for the master key, and popped the padlock. The door swung open on stiff hinges that groaned softly. I froze, counting to 30 in my head. When nobody shouted, I slipped inside the column and pulled the panel shut behind me, plunging myself into absolute blackness. The interior of the tube smelled like old dust, grease, and bird nests. I clicked on my headlamp, throwing a tight cone of light up the vertical shaft. It turned the inside of the column into an endless, rusty tunnel. I started to climb, moving one hand and one foot at a time, keeping my free hand constantly on the side rail. Not because I expected the steel rungs to fail. I knew they were solid. But because habits like that are hard to drop when the ground itself feels unsafe. Halfway up, about 30 feet off the deck, I stopped and killed the light. In the pitch dark, the silence was heavy. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears and the faint wind-swept rush of cars passing through the panels overhead. No sound came from the base of the tube. No hand banged on the access panel. Nobody rattled the ladder. I turned the beam back on and kept moving until my shoulders brushed against the underside of the service hatch. The hatch used a simple slide latch mechanism I could work from either side. I slid the bolt back, pushed up slowly, and eased my head into the gap. The service platform spread out around the center column, a triangular grid of galvanized steel running to the inner edges of the 3 billboard faces. The back of the panels were tight and dark, with just one thin strip of amber light bleeding through where a seam didn't sit flush. Just enough to tell me which direction the plaza lay. I hauled myself through the opening, lowered the heavy hatch cover, and sat with my back against the center column, my harness clips clinking softly against the metal. For the first time in 24 hours, I could see the whole interchange without anyone seeing me. The wind was cleaner up here, colder. That was the moment the billboard stopped being a job site and started looking like a fortress. I was a rat in a steel trap, but at least I was a rat with the high ground. From the service platform, I went through the motions of a standard inspection, mostly to keep my hands busy while my brain tried to catch up. I ran my gloved palm along the cold steel of the inner bracing, checked the torque on the main bolt heads by touch, and stomped my boots into the galvanized floor grid to feel for flex. The structure felt solid exactly the way it always had, built to shrug off 60-mile-an-hour crosswinds and ice loads, steady under my weight. Down below, the plaza felt like it was tilting on an axis I didn't trust, ready to slide into something much worse. Through the narrow vertical seams where the vinyl faces met the frame, I caught thin slices of the lot and the access road. Headlights traced slow, confused circles in the dark, then stopped and died. A line of sedans tried to push back toward the highway entrance, realized it was blocked, and jammed themselves tighter into the gridlock. People moved between the vehicles with that tired, restless shuffle. The walk of someone who knows they're stuck but hasn't figured out a plan beyond waiting for someone else to fix it. I ran the math. If I stayed, I had 3 things going for me: height, a clear 360-degree view, and a single choke point. The billboard checked all 3 boxes perfectly. The problem was everything else. It had 0 amenities. No food, no running water, no heat source, and no way to keep out the wind except for thin sheets of vinyl. If I was going to turn this steel skeleton into a shelter, I would have to build every system that made it livable. And I'd have to do it before the first real blizzard buried us. That reality settled in while the wind cut through my canvas jacket. I climbed back down the ladder, locked the service panel, and walked the back perimeter of the lot to my truck. The noise of the plaza hit me harder at ground level. A chaotic mix of overlapping arguments, the clatter of luggage carts, and the sharp crack of voices raised in panic. Sitting behind the wheel with the engine cold, I flipped over an old work order and started writing. Pen on paper felt grounding. I needed a prioritized list. Water was number 1. Heavy, hard to move, impossible to live without. Food that was calorie-dense and shelf-stable. Blankets and sleeping bags. Construction materials to seal the inside of the frame, lighting that didn't depend on the plaza's grid, and tools, enough hardware to hang everything without compromising the structural integrity of the sign. A highway service plaza is the worst place to be when panic hits, but it's a gold mine if you need to strip it for parts. You have fuel, convenience stores, bathrooms, and maintenance rooms. The trick is moving fast before everyone else realizes they aren't going anywhere. I started small, hitting the fuel station furthest from the main building. The lot there was busy but not gridlocked. Inside, a single clerk with dead eyes watched the news loop on a mounted TV and rang people up without looking at their faces. I grabbed a red plastic basket and walked the aisles, trying to look like just another stranded driver stretching his legs. I prioritized water jugs first, grabbed as many gallon containers as I could carry in one trip without looking like I was hoarding. Then the food aisle, canned soup with pull tabs, beans, vegetables, Spam, anything I could open with a pocket knife. I grabbed bags of rice and pasta I could stuff into the gaps between crates, high-calorie energy bars that stacked well. At the counter, I added a handful of cheap Bic lighters and a brick of matches in plastic wrap. On my way back, I grabbed a bundle of cheap fleece blankets and a box of heavy-duty contractor trash bags. The clerk punched in the numbers without a word. I paid cash, stuffed the receipt in my pocket out of reflex, and carried everything out in 2 slow, deliberate trips. The people in the lot were too busy staring at their phones or arguing to track what I was doing. Loading the truck became a game of Tetris. Tools and spare parts went under the rear bench seat. Food filled the front of the bed, stacked in plastic milk crates. The water jug slid against the back of the cab with a dull, heavy thump that made me wince, but nobody looked my way. I threw an old quilted moving blanket over the pile to break the outline, but I knew I needed more water. Behind the main building, near the loading docks, I found a row of blue 55-gallon drums under a metal overhang. Most were empty, one sloshed heavily. I pried the cap off and sniffed. It smelled like plastic and dust, rainwater. Good enough if I boiled it. Getting a full 400-pound drum into the truck bed solo was physics I couldn't beat. But I didn't need the barrel, just the liquid. A stack of empty 5-gallon fry oil containers sat near the dumpster. I cleaned them in a utility sink, filled 4 from the rain barrel using a siphon hose from my toolkit, and muscled them into the truck bed one by one. The rear suspension sagged a good 2 inches. Before I headed back to the loop, I made one last stop at my company's satellite storage shed near the entrance. It used the same master padlock key as the ladder access. Inside, it was a treasure trove. Metal shelves stacked with spare galvanized brackets, bolts, cable, harnesses, and, best of all, 3 heavy rolls of unused vinyl banner material. I raided it. I took 2 spare climbing harnesses, a bucket of fasteners, a hand winch, and every ratchet strap I could find. The vinyl rolls were awkward dead weight, heavier than they looked, but they were the closest thing I was going to get to real drywall without tearing siding off the Plaza itself. In a dusty box, I found a set of magnetic LED work lights and battery packs. I scooped the whole box into the truck bed. Portable light you can aim is worth its weight in gold when the grid goes down. By the time I pulled back under the billboard, the sky had faded to that flat gray you get right before dawn. I parked close to the base panel to hide my work, shut the engine off, and listened. The Plaza hummed with tension, the highway whispered, and the truck ticked softly as the engine cooled. I was loaded heavy, suspension riding low, bed full of the first layer of what I would need to turn that frame into a fortress. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Once the snow started falling and the exits stopped meaning anything, it might be the only thing that mattered. Hauling everything from the truck bed up 60 feet into the billboard was the first cold proof that this idea was more than a panicked daydream. Sitting on the service platform admiring the view was one thing. Turning that exposed steel grid into a place where a human being could sleep through a Midwestern winter meant hauling hundreds of pounds of dead weight up a tight vertical ladder alone. And I had to do it while the lot below churned with restless people, none of whom would hesitate to take what I had if I slipped and dropped a crate. I had to prioritize. If someone popped my tailgate while I was halfway up the tube, what could I afford to lose? Not the food, not the water. I parked the truck so the tailgate was almost touching the base panel, opened the service door just wide enough to slide my body through, and left the cab unlocked. If the world was really ending, the title in the glove box and the locks on the doors didn't matter anymore. Inside the ladder cage, I clipped my safety harness to the vertical rail, dropped back down into the bed, and started loading. I filled the first milk crate with cans and dry bags until the strap cut into my shoulder. Heavy but manageable. Too light meant wasting energy on extra trips. Too heavy meant shaking legs and missed steps on the rungs. I needed a payload weight I could repeat 10 times without losing fine motor control. The first climb with a full crate hammered the lesson home fast. The hard plastic edges of the crate banged against my hip bone with every step, pulling my center of gravity off kilter. About 20 feet up, one dusty steel rung felt slick under my boot, and I slipped a fraction of an inch. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stopped right there, hanging in the dark, and forced my breathing to slow down. Then I kept going, counting the rungs in sets of 10. At the platform, I hauled the crate over the lip of the hatch, set it by the center column, stretched my cramping fingers until the ache subsided, and went back down for more. Trip by trip, The empty steel ring around the column filled in. 2 crates of canned food and dry goods, then the heavy water containers that sloshed with every step, then the bundles of blankets, the box of lights, and the bucket of hardware. Each load created a small island around the central pillar, a rough circle of objects that represented heat, calories, and light, replacing the bare, indifferent grid. When my hands started to shake uncontrollably on the ladder, I stopped, forced myself to eat half an energy bar and drink a few swallows of water, and only then went for the next run. The vinyl rolls were too heavy and awkward to carry on my back. I anchored the manual hand winch to a heavy-duty bracket on the column using 2 short ratchet straps. I ran the steel cable down through the open hatch and hooked it through a loop of webbing I'd tied around the first roll. From the platform, I cranked the winch handle, guiding the heavy roll with the toe of my boot as it scraped and snagged on the edge of the opening. It came up slow, swaying in the dark shaft, but steady. The second roll followed the same path. When both were safely on the deck, I pulled the cable clear and stowed the winch. By the time the truck bed was stripped bare, my shoulders burned like I'd been beaten, and the skin on my palms felt paper thin even through my work gloves. I closed the base panel at ground level, climbed the 60 feet one last time, and pulled the heavy hatch shut behind me. For the first time, the billboard held more than just metal and bolts. It held survival. It was still exposed, freezing, and loud, but I wasn't starting from zero anymore. The service platform wrapped around the center column in a triangle. 3 narrow walkways of steel grating extended toward the inner edges of the billboard faces. There was enough square footage to walk a tight loop or lie down if I curled up. Everything I built had to fit inside that volume, and crucially, it had to stay below the top line of the panels and above the bottom rail. From the road, this had to look like nothing more than a tired advertisement over a busy exit. Walls were the priority. Wind strips body heat faster than ambient cold ever will. Using a permanent marker, I traced the inner seams where each face met the steel frame, marking the load-bearing points. Then I cut the first sheet of heavy vinyl. I made it wide enough to hang from just under the top, cross-bracing down to the grid floor. I used short cinch straps and metal clips to secure the top edge to the inner frame. The heavy sheet dropped with a dull, heavy crackle until it brushed my boots. It tried to billow like a sail in the draft, fighting me. I wrestled it down, pinning the bottom edge behind a strip of aluminum scrap I bolted into the floor grid at 3 points. I repeated the process on the second and third faces, working slower as the cold stiffened my hands. But as the last sheet went up, the atmosphere changed. The platform transformed from an open catwalk into a small, triangular room. The sound from the lot lost its sharp edge, muffled by the heavy vinyl. The biting drafts that had knifed through the open frame now slid harmlessly along the outside of my new walls. I wasn't going to blind myself, though. I needed eyes on the ground. Near the top of each face, I used my utility knife to cut a narrow vertical slit in the vinyl, just wide enough for 2 fingers. I taped the edges to create a clean viewport I could close with a small weighted flap. From the highway, those gaps would read as seams. From inside, they gave me 3 clear sight lines: the plaza, the on-ramps, and the open stretch of interstate. Next came the floor. The existing industrial grating was fine for work boots, but it was murder on knees and ribs. Down at the loading dock, I had scavenged 2 low wooden pallets and a set of metal display shelves. Up here, I laid the shelves flat around the column, tying them to the grid with zip ties. Then I set the pallets on top, creating a raised, insulated patch. I threw 2 fleece blankets and an old quilted moving pad over the new platform and tested it by lying flat. I counted the spots that bit into my back, 2, maybe 3. I could live with that. Finally, I secured the door. For the hatch, I cut a solid steel bar from a spare bracket and dropped it across 2 saddles I'd bolted to the floor. It was a simple deadbolt system. Anything coming up that ladder would hit solid steel before it hit me. I sat back against the column, listening to the wind whip against my vinyl walls, and for the first time in 2 days, I let my eyes close. Cold was the next enemy on the list, and unlike the infected, it didn't sleep. Walls and a patched floor meant the wind couldn't strip the heat away instantly, but the ambient temperature still dropped like a stone after dark. My breath came out in heavy white plumes and my fingers went stiff and clumsy inside my gloves within minutes of stopping work. I knew the math. Without a reliable heat source, the first real Midwestern freeze would finish me off just as surely as a bite. Open flame and thin vinyl walls are a recipe for a melted coffin, so I had to start small and smart. In the service shed, I had spotted a dented steel tool chest, and by the loading dock, a waste pile held a cracked truck wheel rim and a few sections of rusted exhaust piping. Late the next afternoon, when the crowd below had pressed inside the main building to stare at the scrolling disaster on the news, I climbed down. I moved with the deliberate pace of a maintenance worker on a parts run, head down, purpose in my step, and grabbed what I needed. I used the steel tool chest as a test bed. Back up on the platform, I set it on the grid near the center column, filled the bottom with a layer of gravel I'd scooped from a decorative planter, and lit a single candle inside. With the vinyl hung and the hatch blocked, the air quality changed. It didn't turn warm exactly, but the biting edge dulled. The candle proved a point. In a space this small, it wouldn't take a bonfire to make a difference. It just required a way to manage the smoke. I didn't have a proper wood stove, so I built the closest thing I could manage with hand tools. The scavenged truck rim, laid flat on the grid, gave me a heavy steel base that wouldn't slide or tip. A shallow stainless steel steam table pan from the snack counter fit inside it to act as a firebox and ash catcher. The chimney was the tricky part. From the storage shed, I'd taken a length of straight exhaust pipe and a 90-degree elbow. I used a hacksaw to cut a hole in one of the face panels, positioned high up and angled away from the prevailing wind. The hole was just big enough to pass the pipe through. I ran the stack from the rim, up past shoulder height, and then turned it out through the cut, feeding it into the gap between the inner structural frame and the outer face panel. From the road, it would look like just another dark support bracket or a shadow. From inside, it carried the smoke and deadly fumes up and out without filling my box with a fog that would choke me. I burned it in slowly. The first fire was just cardboard, broken shelf slats, and pieces of pallet wood I'd stripped into kindling. I needed to burn off the old paint and grease from the rim before I could trust the air. The smell was acrid, burning rubber and oil, so I kept the hatch cracked and watched the smoke. With one of the viewing slits loosened on the opposite face to create a draft, the fire drew steadily. The smoke twisted into the pipe and vanished. The vinyl near the improvised stack grew warm to the touch but didn't soften or melt. Fire solved one problem but created two others. Anything that makes light can draw eyes. Anything that makes a smell carries downwind. I adopted strict light discipline. I kept the flames low and fed them slowly. No big bursts, no full logs that would crack and pop. On clear days, I let the billboard soak up the weak winter sun, trapping a little greenhouse warmth behind the dark vinyl backing. Water came next. The jugs in the truck and the greasy oil containers I had filled from the blue rain barrel wouldn't last the winter. I didn't trust the Plaza's tap lines to stay pressurized. Once the power grid failed for good, the pumps would die and the pipes would freeze. The highway drains and Plaza gutters held puddles, but they were coated with films of diesel oil and antifreeze. I needed a source I could control. The air tasted like snow. I felt that dry, metallic cut in my throat every time I stepped onto the ladder. I needed a way to catch meltwater without leaning out into the open every time the sky turned white. Inside the faces, I bolted 3 shallow metal drip trays under the top horizontal bracing, one per side, sloped aggressively toward the center column. I lined them with pieces of heavy black plastic cut from a broken display stand. The black plastic would absorb whatever solar gain we got, helping to melt snow that drifted through the seams. I rigged short downspouts made from trimmed exhaust tubing to carry the melt toward 2 clean 5-gallon buckets I lashed to the column. When snow landed on the outer faces and worked its way through the seams, it would hit the trays, melt in the slightly warmer air behind the panels, and run down into my reservoir. It wouldn't be a fast process, but winter is long, and a slow, steady trickle beats scavenging from toilet tanks after a crowd has fought over the last bottle of Dasani. Light was the final basic system. The LED work lamps from the shed were powerful but harsh. I wrapped each lens with a swatch of cloth cut from a fleece blanket and taped the edges with electrical tape. That diffused the harsh white beams into soft amber pools I could point at my hands, or the floor without leaking light through the exterior seams. Power for those lights came from the rechargeable battery packs in the box, and when those ran low, I had to take a risk. I ran a heavy-duty extension cord up through the ladder hatch and plugged it into an inverter I strapped to the column. To charge them, I had to idle the truck. I did this only during the noisiest times of day, sitting in the cab watching the RPMs and the temperature gauge, praying that the low rumble of my engine would be lost in the background noise of the Plaza's generators. With the walls hanging tight, a raised and insulated floor patch, a fire I could trust not to kill me, and a gravity-fed water system waiting for the first snow, the billboard stopped feeling like a bare steel frame. It started feeling like the shell of a place I could actually hold. By the time the first real storm warning came over the radio, the billboard felt halfway claimed. Food and water ringed the center column. The small stove sat bolted in place with its thin pipe venting through the panel, and the raised floor patch gave me one spot that stayed bearable if I fed the fire right. It wasn't comfort, but it was mine, high above a plaza that looked more like a problem every day. Down below, the mood tightened instead of easing. Families who had tried to wait this out crammed back into their cars and pushed toward the ramps. Some reached the on-ramp before a crash locked the lane and turned it into a horn-blaring knot. Others never left their rows. Delivery trucks stopped showing up entirely. Lights inside the main building flickered and stayed dim longer each time. A few shapes in the lot started walking with that slow, stiff drag I had already seen on screens, and once you see it in person, you don't mistake it for anything else. I narrowed my routine to the basics I trusted. Each morning I checked the hatch bar and ladder first, listening for new scrapes on the inside of the service door. Then I walked the platform and pressed every panel seam, looking through each narrow slit to see how the pattern in the lot and on the ramps had changed. After that, I counted crates and water and made sure nothing had shifted without my hands on it. Only when those steps were done did I warm my fingers over a low flame and let the radio run until the batteries slipped toward empty. Most broadcasts repeated the same lines. Stay inside, avoid contact, do not approach anyone acting strangely. The short notes tacked onto the end mattered more than the calm voices. Power failures in several regions, fuel shortages, road closures due to incidents. Each new line like that made the plaza look less like a safe stop and more like a box that would snap shut on whoever stayed. I saw her on a flat gray afternoon with air that bit the inside of my nose. I was checking the mounts under one of the melt trays when a patch of yellow touched the edge of my vision. When I slid a vinyl flap aside and looked down, a woman stood on the service road with both hands raised and her head tipped back, staring straight up at my face of the sign. A yellow pack hung from her shoulders and a dark jacket covered her to the throat. Sound bounced around inside the frame, but her voice still reached me in rough pieces. I caught "up there" and "know you're in" and "just talk." I could have stepped back and let the flap fall. From the ground, the billboard still passed as empty if you wanted to believe it. Instead, I pushed the slit a little wider and said, "Stay where you are and do not touch the ladder." She turned toward my voice like she could see through the gap and said, "I figured somebody had taken this thing by now. The service truck parked under it. The way the panels sit too tight for an abandoned board. The smoke line that does not match anything on the plaza roof. I am not here to drag you down. I just want a word before I decide where to freeze tonight." Pretending she had not noticed the changes would have been pointless. From the highway, the board might look neglected. From that strip of pavement, anyone who knew steel would see extra straps and plates. I kept one eye on the access lane and the fuel islands and said, "Talking is fine, climbing is not. Start with your name." She shifted her weight like her legs wanted one more step she would not give them, then answered, "Noelle Archer. I left my car 2 days back when the jam locked solid and people started checking doors that were not theirs. I have been sleeping in the brush behind the far diesel pumps and watching this sign for a full day. I wanted to see if you were careful or just scared before I yelled up. Careful or scared was a fair line. I let a few seconds pass and asked, "Are you sick? Any bites, deep scratches, blood on you that is not yours? Any fever you cannot explain?" She shook her head once, slow, not the fast denial you hear when someone wants past a gate, and said, "No bites and no fever. I saw what this does at a rest stop 3 hours east. If I thought there was even a small chance of turning, I would not walk toward a metal frame with one way in. That would be a bad plan for both of us." The service road behind her stayed empty. Nobody stepped out from between cars, nobody moved in the weeds across the ditch. She looked worn down rather than wired, shoulders sloped the way they get when someone has been moving too long with nowhere to land. I said, "If I let you up here, you follow my rules. You move when I say move, you stay quiet when I say quiet, and if anything breaks skin or you feel wrong, you tell me before you try to ride it out. If that feels like too much, turn around now while the choice is still yours." She let out a breath that showed white in the air and said, "Rules are fine. I am not asking for a free bed. I can work. I did structural inspections before this, bridges, towers, big signs, anything they wanted stamped safe. I know what stress does to bad bolts and thin steel. Up there beats any car in this lot, but not if you hang too much on the wrong piece." That line cut through the rest, hard. Gavin came into our world on a day that already felt stretched thin. The first snow had fallen and melted into dirty bands along the curbs, and the air sat in that tight space where it hurt to breathe but would not freeze the lot solid. Down below the plaza was a churn of slush, wheel ruts, and people who were out of options. Up in the billboard, Noelle and I had settled into a rough pattern. We checked the ladder and hatch every morning, walked the inside edge of each face, pressed every brace she did not like, and only then sat by the small stove long enough to feel our hands again and listen for changes in the wind. She slept lighter than I did and woke at every change in sound. A stained notebook hung from a strap on the column with quick sketches of joints and short lines like "add brace here" and "check weld after next blow." When gusts hit hard, she would set her palm against the panel and say in a low voice, "Top brace is working too hard," and I would add it to my list for the next clear spell. We were tightening the hatch bar that afternoon, adding a second plate and 2 more bolts when the first shot cracked across the plaza. The sound was sharp and dry, not the hollow bang of a trunk slamming or a pallet tipping off a jack. I went to the slit facing the far fuel station and eased the flap back while Noelle killed the lamp and moved up beside me. 3 men walked between the pumps and the kiosk at the far edge of the lot. 2 carried rifles, the third had a pistol low along his thigh. Their coats were thick but mismatched, layers pulled from different closets, but they moved with the same loose confidence. They did not rush or look around. Near the air pump, a 4th figure knelt on the pavement with his hands spread flat. He wore a trucker's jacket and looked older than the others, shoulders rounded like somebody had set a load on him and never taken it off. One of the riflemen kicked his hand away from something on the ground, then leveled the barrel a few inches from the back of the man's neck. I could not hear the words, only the tone. Demands, not questions. The trucker shook his head once and kept his eyes down. The man with the pistol stepped closer, pointed toward the main building, then toward the rows of cars, then back at the man's face. Even from the billboard, it was clear enough. "Tell us what we want or this ends badly," Noelle said under her breath. "Watch how they stand. 2 wide, 1 close, 1 off to the side. They have done this somewhere else." I answered, "We stay dark. We do not shout. We do not move unless they head for the ladder." She gave one short nod and kept watching while I checked the other 2 faces to make sure no one had drifted up under us. The standoff ended fast. The trucker rose to his knees, said something that made the talker laugh, then reached for his jacket pocket with a slow, hopeful movement. The rifle fired a second later. He dropped forward and did not move again. They rolled him with a boot, checked his pockets, pulled something small free, and left him face down on the wet pavement. For the next 20 minutes, they worked the lot, moving from car to car, testing doors, smashing glass, dragging bags into a pile in the access lane. Twice more the guns barked, once into the air to scatter a line by the main doors, once at a shape that ran between two trucks. Every shot bounced up through the steel and sat behind my teeth, but they never once looked up. They brought Gavin into it without meaning to. He came in from the far side of the interchange driving a tired delivery van with one headlight dead and the other yellow with age. Somebody had painted over the logo, but the ghost of a grocery chain still showed through. The back doors were strapped shut with wide ratchet ties and the rear axle rode low, so whatever he had inside was heavy and worth fuel. He braked when he saw the bodies and the armed men at the pumps. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might throw the van into reverse and try the ramp, but the jam at the top of the loop had not cleared and the lane behind him was already half blocked. He killed the lights instead and let the van roll to a stop behind a dead semi. One of the riflemen spotted the movement and cut across the lot with that same loose, careless walk. He stopped a few steps from the driver's door and raised the muzzle just high enough to make the point. You did not need sound to read the script. Come out slow, hands where we can see them, no sudden moves. Gavin opened the door halfway and put both hands out, palms empty, shoulders tight under a dark hoodie. He said something that made the man flick his eyes toward the back doors, then waved the others over with a short jerk of his head. Attention shifted to the van. Nobody was looking at the billboard. Noelle whispered, if they spare him, they keep him to drive that thing. If they kill him, they still take the van. Either way, whoever got that load here understands roads we do not. I said, if we pull him up, he knows we are here and what we have. We do not get to erase that. She answered, then we wait for the one moment that is not theirs and we grab it. The men pushed Gavin to the rear and made him unhook the straps. When he hesitated on the second, the pistol man drove the barrel into his ribs and snapped something short that made him flinch and move faster. The doors swung open. That was our problem. The snow held off until the plaza was already ground down to the bone. Most of the lot had given up, pretending this was a temporary stop, and accepted it was a trap. Then the sky turned flat and heavy, the color of a wet bruise, and the first band came through sideways. A gray curtain that erased the highway signs and turned the world into white noise. We had been expecting it. Noelle had circled potential dates on a scrap of calendar she kept tucked in her notebook. Gavin didn't need paper to read the weather. He stood by the hatch the night before, watching the pressure drop, and said, if I still had a rig, I would park it and lose the keys. We didn't have a rig. We had a billboard full of patched metal and 3 people who needed it to hold against a Midwestern blizzard. Inside, we pulled everything tighter. We ratcheted down the extra straps on the meltwater trays until they hummed. We ran short safety lines from the stacked crates to the floor grid so nothing would shift if the tower swayed. We took strips of scavenged upholstery foam and jammed them into the worst seams, sealing them with duct tape. Noelle walked the inside edge with her palm pressed against each steel brace, listening to the stress in the metal. She tapped the main diagonal on the plaza side and said, this one worries me. I said, then we watch that one first and put it at the top of the inspection list. When the snow finally hit, the highway noise vanished fast. The steady, reassuring hiss of tires on pavement dropped to a smear and then to dead silence. The wind took over, leaning into the vinyl faces until the entire steel frame hummed like a tuning fork. Powder worked its way through microscopic gaps. Our vinyl walls snapped and flexed, fighting the gale, but the fasteners held. Every time we cracked the hatch to check the ground, cold air poured into the space like water, heavy and instant. Down below, the plaza turned into layers of white. Cars became low, soft mounds with only their side mirrors showing. The semi-trucks rose like dark ridges in a landscape that was losing all its definition. Anyone still walking in a coat went inside the main building or disappeared between the rows. After dark, the only figures left in the open were the infected. The cold slowed them, but it didn't stop them. They drifted in from the ramps and the access road, the wet snow sticking to their faces until they looked like blank white masks. They slipped on the ice, fell hard and got up again without a sound. They just kept moving in slow, jagged lines driven by something that didn't care about frostbite. We watched in short shifts through the viewing slits. They didn't have a plan, but the lot shaped their movement. The drifts, the drainage ditches, and the gaps between buried cars funneled the bodies into a few clear strips of pavement. One of those strips ran straight past the base of our sign. The first time one of them hit the ladder, we felt it through the soles of our boots. A dull, heavy knock climbed the hollow column and rattled the steel hatch bar. Gavin set his palm on the metal floor and said, "Not a bumper." A second hit followed, rhythmic and mindless, then a sliding scrape as a body lost its footing and went down along the service panel. We had argued about guns before the storm hit. Bullets were limited and sound carried for miles over hard-packed snow. One shot might clear the immediate space, but it would also paint a target on the one structure in the valley that still had heat. The rule we settled on was simple. We do not fire unless something is actually climbing. The heavy chain and scrap metal we had wired along the lower curve of the monopole finally proved their worth. Each time a body slammed into the base, it rolled and twisted off the round steel instead of locking in. Limbs caught on the chain links, bent at wrong angles, and then dropped into the shallow drainage ditch. When one jammed in a way that bothered us, creating a step for the next one, Gavin cracked the hatch a hand's width. I leaned out with the long pole we had built from a steel aisle bar and a roof rack component. The sharpened hook on the end bit into cloth or frozen flesh. One hard, leverage-assisted pull, and the frozen weight slid free. By the second day, they no longer came alone. Clumps of them pushed each other through the drifts. Some moved so slow their feet barely lifted from the slush. Others threw themselves at anything that stuck above the snow line. A few slapped at the lower rungs of the ladder again, but none reached higher than the third step before slipping. Inside, the rim stove worked overtime. Frost crept across the inner surface of the vinyl walls. We tightened our rotation. One person on hatch watch, one on window watch, one managing the fire and melting snow for water. Nobody was off duty for more than a short stretch of restless sleep. The sound came just before dawn on the third day. It wasn't a tap. A deep structural shove ran up the column, vibrating the floor grid, followed by a grinding squeal of metal on metal and a heavier knock that made the entire platform jump. Noelle looked at me, mouthed, "Not wind," and we moved to the hatch. The snow had blurred the edges of the world, but the new shadow below was close and solid. When we eased the hatch open an inch, freezing air poured in around the outline of a delivery truck. It was now pressed tight against the base of our pole. It had sat a few rows out when the storm started, but either its parking brake had snapped in the cold or someone had tried to rock it free and died at the wheel. Two frozen bodies lay crumpled between the grill and the frame. Worse, the truck's hood now sat directly under the first rungs of our ladder. Left alone, it was a perfect step waiting for anything with enough will to climb. We couldn't move the truck. The drifts had locked it in, but we could change what it offered. In a handful of adrenaline-fueled runs working between wind gusts, we went down the ladder. We slipped out the service panel and stripped a section of galvanized guardrail from the side of a buried flatbed trailer. It was heavy, awkward work with frozen gloves. We dragged the rail onto the truck's hood and pinned it at a steep, aggressive angle using self-tapping fasteners and bent brackets we'd brought down from the shop. When we finished, the truck hood no longer looked like a step. It looked like a slick steel ramp angled sharply away from the ladder. Anything that tried to climb onto it would slide off into the ditch. We sealed the panel, climbed back up the 60 feet and sat by the stove while our hands stopped shaking. Later that night, the wind finally eased. The steady, violent hiss on the faces turned into the odd, soft tap of loose flakes. When I checked the slits again, the plaza was just a white, silent field with half-buried lumps and dark shapes locked in place. The billboard still stood. So did we. The next move was still ours. The storm didn't fix anything, it just traded one set of problems for another. The snow hid the wrecks and muffled the sound of the infected, but it also choked off the last trickle of people and supplies that had been feeding the plaza. No new delivery trucks rolled in, no fresh cars pushed up the ramps, and the digital fuel price boards stayed dark. Whatever sat down there now was all this place was ever going to get. We still had enough to last if we were careful, but careful turned into a full-time job. Careful meant no comfort fires just to take the chill off. It meant no long radio scans just because the silence felt heavy. It meant no extra bites out of a spam can just because someone had a bad day. It meant physically counting the food stocks and shaking every water jug instead of guessing. Leaving didn't make sense. Every time one of us checked a viewing slit, the answer lay out there in hard, cold lines. Drifts buried the shoulders, wrecks choked the off-ramps, and frozen bodies lay exactly where they had dropped. Even if we walked out with full packs and fresh legs, the first mile would be nothing but exposure. So instead of planning an escape, we planned how to make this thin steel triangle work better. Noelle sketched a simple map of the plaza and ramps on a piece of scrap vinyl. She marked the rows we had already stripped, back rooms in the main building that might still hold hardware or winter clothes, and paths that kept some cover between dead vehicles. Gavin added notes about deep drifts and slick patches of black ice. We taped that map to the vinyl wall where all three of us could see it from the stove. On calmer days, when the wind dropped below the threshold we trusted, we went down in pairs. One watched the ladder and the perimeter under the sign with a rifle ready but low. The other moved fast, hit the marked spots, and came back as soon as their pack felt heavy. Heavy coats, wool socks, loose batteries, hand tools, and scrap metal still turned up if you knew where to look. Inside the sign, we made small changes that added up to survival. Noelle braced the meltwater trays so the next heavy snow load wouldn't bow them. Gavin rigged a simple pulley system over the hatch so we could haul scavenged loads up without blowing out the climbers' shoulders. I rewired the work lights so a single master switch by the column could kill every lamp instantly if a car rolled close or a flare lit up the snow. We built a habit of talking through every change before we made it. If someone wanted to cut a new slit, run the stove hotter, move a crate, or stretch a radio call 5 minutes longer, they had to say what they wanted and exactly how it could go wrong. Most ideas passed the test. The ones we turned down went on a short list titled, "Not Now." Nights stayed the hardest. The wind kept finding new notes to play in the steel, little rattles and pops that sounded like footsteps until you had heard the same one 3 times. Sleep came in short, shallow dives. We started rotating who took the shift between midnight and dawn so the dead hours didn't always land on the same shoulders. The radio finally gave us something other than warnings and dead air. One gray afternoon, a new voice cut through the static. A woman, tired but steady, not a recorded loop. She said her group was holding a small town 3 exits north. They had walls, wells, a few generators, and some kind of deal with whoever wore a badge before the collapse. She told anyone listening to stay off the highway at night and watch for hand-painted signs on the overpasses. Then the signal faded back into white noise. For the rest of that day, our eyes drifted toward the north slit more than they should have. A place with walls and clean water sounded like a fairy tale from the old world. Gavin rolled a hex nut between his fingers and said, "If that call's real, that's the first good news I've heard in weeks." Noelle watched the map and answered, "Or it's bait. You say walls and wells. You pull in everybody desperate enough to believe it." We didn't vote on anything that night. We sat close to the stove and let the question hang there, suspended in the smell of wood smoke and hot metal. Stay with what we knew, or walk towards something that might not exist when we got there. The billboard creaked once in the wind and held. For now, that was all the answer we had. We stayed where we were and kept the idea of those 3 exits filed under later, not under never. We are still in the sign as I tell this. Snow lies in hard, dirty ridges along the plaza lanes. The main building sits dark and hollow most nights, and the only lights we trust are the ones we switch on with our own hands. From the highway, we still look like a faded advertisement hanging over an exit that isn't worth the fuel to investigate. That is exactly how we want it. Inside, the three of us move in a tight, practiced loop. Hatch, stove, water, windows, then back again. Gavin checks the ladder and the makeshift ramp on the truck hood every morning, pressing his palm to the steel to feel for any new vibrations or movement. Noelle walks the panels and braces, updating the short notes in her logbook. I track the food and parts, counting exactly what we use and redlining what we can no longer replace. We have enough to finish this winter if we stay smart. We have enough fuel for small, smokeless fires, enough snow to melt for water, and enough food to keep our hands steady. What we don't have is comfort. The space is tight, every sound carries. If one of us turns the wrong way, there is nowhere to go to be alone. That is why the rules matter. They are the only thing keeping us from tearing each other apart. Keep your gear in the same spot so nobody trips in the dark. Say where you are going, even if it is just 2 steps toward a viewing slit. Call out clearly when you come back up through the hatch so nobody levels a rifle at you out of reflex. Fix something small every day, even if it is just tightening a loose strap or tying a better knot. Talk before you cut or move anything the others depend on. We wrote those rules on the back of an old strip of vinyl and taped it to the center column. On the worst days, when the wind makes the frame hum like a dying engine and the stove won't catch right away, you look at that list and you follow it because it has already carried you this far. The dead haven't learned any new tricks. They still follow sound and broken light. They still pack into the low spots out of the wind, and they still hit the steel with the same dull, mindless persistence. People are the ones who keep changing. Some drive past fast with their windows up, eyes straight ahead. Some creep along the access road slowly, counting cars and checking doors. A few walk alone with their hands in their pockets, doing the same survival math we did before we climbed up here. We don't shout down offers of help. We don't wave people up. Help up here isn't free. When someone comes close and looks like they might be worth the risk, we watch first. We watch how they move, how they treat the bodies they find. Whether they touch car doors because they need shelter or because they just want whatever is inside. If any of that feels wrong, we let them pass. On clearer days, we talk about what comes after the thaw. Small things at first. Building better storage racks under the floor patch. Turning one corner into a proper workbench. Maybe dragging some planters up from the Plaza roof and trying to grow something in the strip of ground under the sign once the earth softens. It gives our hands a direction when there is no urgent fire to put out. Sometimes we talk about the town 3 exits north and the woman on the radio. None of us fully believes in safe zones anymore, but none of us has written them off either. If the broadcast comes back in the spring and the map on the wall still says we have a shot, maybe one of us makes a run to see if the story matches the signal. Maybe we stay here and just listen. If you ever end up under this sign and the panels don't look too warped and the ramp is still passable, you might feel the same pull I did that first night. Height, a single way up. Metal that has already seen more winters than you have. If we are still here, you won't see us right away. Stand in the open, keep your hands clear, and speak like you know the cost of noise. If your story makes sense and your skin looks clean, maybe we talk. If not, keep walking. Until then, we keep doing what works. We wake, we check the steel, we melt snow, we ration, we listen, and we write down what saves us so we don't have to trust our tired memories. This billboard used to sell things nobody needs. Now it holds 3 people who refuse to fall off the map. For the moment, that is enough. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.